Uh, uh, this is a fun one. I met Laura first almost 5 years ago. She joined Adobe and joined the Photoshop on iPad team, which was a team that I also worked closely with for several years. I asked Laura if she wanted me to say any random facts about her while I was up here, and the one thing she threw out is that she worked on a farm, on a pig farm in South Korea for a year. So I have serious questions about what she did. Now, Laura is very well known in the Swift and iOS community. She's a very accomplished speaker. She's spoken all over the world. One of her recent talks that she was very brave to give was C++ is still spry, which she gave at a Swift conference. So I think we've pulled her over to the dark side here. In a prior life, Laura taught languages, not programming languages, but spoken languages. And I imagine she was a great teacher. I think she would have gotten along well with Socrates. She approaches new problems with genuine curiosity. And she asks a lot of questions, and very quickly you realize that the insight you gain from answering her questions means you're the one that's being taught. So Laura's become somebody that my entire team looks to for guidance and for assistance. She helped Dave and I on our talk, which is on Friday, and she's just a wonderful person to work with. So it's my pleasure to introduce to all of you Laura Savino.
Hi. Thank you for the super kind introduction. Sean, like he said, I work on the Photoshop team. And for Adobe, I'm based in Seattle. Before I get into it, I am going to highlight other CppCon 2023 speakers from Adobe. I tried doing this after the talk in a practice run, and I just forgot. So I want to wholeheartedly recommend these talks. So remember how Bjarne said, everyone talks about performance, but no one knows how to measure it? That's because they haven't seen Marcos's profiling talk. I got to see an earlier version of this talk while I was doing some in-depth profiling this year, and I now actually keep his slides locally on my computer because they are an excellent reference. Marcos is a researcher who also used to be a professor working with high-performance computing, and he is a great teacher and lecturer. Friday, just after lunch, as Sean mentioned, he and Dave Abrahams are presenting Contracts, which changes how you think about code and errors and lossy communication. And this one, as Sean alluded to, I can especially vouch for because Dave especially tried out some of his early material on me, and so I helped him calibrate it for kind of mortals. I'm also interested in this one, I hope I can say this, because these two apparently have vehemently disagreed on like core aspects of their material, and we get to see that dialogue. I'm really excited. Then Friday, just before the closing keynote, David Sankel with Validity, another in the series from Adobe's Software Technology Labs, whose charter is improving software practices at Adobe and beyond. I have to recommend this one as a language nerd because he's going to deep into the idea of validity itself. Plus, David is the one who convinced me to apply to present here, so thank you. Back to coping with other people's code. So I live in a small craftsman house. It was built in the 1920s. It has lived through some things. It was painted with, at the time, a state-of-the-art, very durable kind of paint that people finally accepted around the 1960s is a neurotoxin. Yeah, lead paint used to be the good stuff. But the people who owned the house before us just painted over it straight, so it was really peeling badly when we bought it. And we had a toddler, so the lead paint chips obviously had to go immediately. Replacing the siding was technically an option, but the siding boards are old-growth cedar, like Pacific Northwest, right? Replacing them with something equivalent is unlikely to be either affordable or ethical. So we had some certified folks come kind of scrape off what they could before we also repainted over the lead. We haven't fixed everything, though. There's a section of the hallway that we all know not to step on too hard because it'll give you splinters, and there's a whole litany of other issues. Now, I am not asking for home improvement suggestions here. We could either fix our house or we could live in our house. And this scraping what you can and painting over the rest, it doesn't not apply to a lot of our large legacy code bases, right? So I initially come home from conferences, so excited because I've heard so many better ways to do software. And then I come back to my code base and almost none of them can work, right? For a whole variety of reasons, only some of which are technical. Some of them might be social. Someone with a lot of power is going to say no. Some of them are contractual. I asked about changing a particular configuration mechanism in our app, and one of the principals was like, that is a good modification. But I wonder about our older support contracts on some of these previous versions. And it means I couldn't make this modification because someone umpteen years ago signed a legal contract that we would keep things the same. So it can be deeply, deeply disappointing to go home and realize that many of the things you wish were better are just not going to change. Maybe someday, but I'm so sorry for most of you, it is not going to be yet. My hope is that this talk will kind of ease your re-entry because we're going to be coping with other people's code for the foreseeable future. And by the way, coping is not actually shorthand for changing all the wrong code until it is up to snuff, my snuff. It is hard to touch large swaths of a legacy code base without causing near catastrophic bugs. And even if you could and you wanted to, there are very few software products that are so financially solvent that they can let a bunch of super senior engineers stop feature work and bug fixing long enough to fundamentally change the way literally everything works. Bjarne did the math on this for us, right? It is a tough proposition. So this advice is not going to be just to rewrite it all until it's unobjectionable to you. You're going to pick pragmatically which areas to kind of scrape and which to completely replace at great cost. And since saying yes to some things means saying no to others, you will continue to interact with design patterns that you hate, and you will continue to have feelings about them. And triaging, putting things in this indefinite won't fix state, it is discomforting, right? To say the least, for those of us who like doing good work. Like for me, one of the great pleasures of my life is getting to a table in a cafe, setting down my coffee, noticing a real wobble, and then ever so casually kind of popping down under the table to twirl down one of those levelers that lives under the legs. It is now fixed for me and whoever sits down at the table next to me. Just bask in the pleasure of that with me for a minute. It's so good. My fix-it drive is really strong. My husband says I have a particular look on my face when we're having a conversation, maybe on a date, a nice restaurant, and I notice something external to the conversation that I suddenly feel a great personal burden to fix. Like once I actually leapt up out the door, caught up to a car because they had left their stroller behind on the sidewalk. I'm really proud of that one still. But I've had to start triaging my fix-it response. Like I saw a plastic bag blowing down a busy street in my neighborhood and thought, no, I am carrying a baby. I have to let that litter go. So that's where this talk is coming from. You want to make things better. You have the skills to make things better, but sometimes you are also carrying a baby. Don't drop the baby. Now, to feel more or less okay about my code and its trade-offs at the end of the day, I've had to adopt a dozen different coping strategies, some of which are actually backed by research that I'll share with you, but all of which I've found personally helpful because this is going to come up for your whole career. A lot of our coding classes, software interviews, they emphasize coming up with your own solutions to problems, but then you get on the job and you find out, wow, a lot of this is dealing with the stuff that already exists in the code base. Now, I'm going to present various emotions that coding throws at you in a kind of career arc, but it's more of a frequency table because yes, you are more likely to be worried about your capabilities in the beginning of the career. You're more likely to be annoyed at the ignorant turkeys who wrote the code toward the end. But I would argue that if you're super senior and you haven't slightly doubted your capabilities in the past month, maybe you're not being challenged enough. And if you're super new to coding and you've literally never seen code that made you say, wow, what were you thinking? You need to get out and read more code because there is atrocious code out there that's propping up billion-dollar industries, and it is humbling and important to realize it. Okay, let's get into the arc. Starting off, now, I'm gonna use a little bit of rude language here because this is what my brain says to me. If your brain never pulls this kind of crap with you, good. But for the rest of us, we've got to fight this kind of attack. It's a really insidious one that's coming from inside the house. And for me, I found an unexpected mindset shift that actually makes all the difference when my brain is pulling that, oh no, I'm too stupid for this code, for this job, for this industry. It spirals with me. I don't try to argue with my brain. It has a strong recency bias, like all brains, and it has a bunch of data showing that I am not currently capable of doing this task. So I stop arguing. Okay, sure, yeah, I'm too dumb to understand this code. I would like to keep my job, though. What should someone too dumb to understand this code do next? And that's when I get ideas that can actually change the situation. Maybe I watch a tutorial video all the way through, even rewind a little, or I'll ask a colleague for help sooner than I otherwise would. Or even totally reframe and acknowledge that, you know what, yes, this code is too dense for me to understand. But you know, I'm not significantly dumber than the average software dev, right? If I'm having trouble here, someone else on the team will too, and this code desperately needs a comment. I'll write one and then ask for an edit from the original author because we all know the fastest way to get feedback from a busy person is to show them a potentially public-facing comment that has some inaccuracies. So this kind of fine, what should I do next? This is an actionable thought while having a feeling that's usually a dead end. Instead of spending a bunch of energy trying to believe, I think I can, just shrugging and saying, no, I clearly can't right now. So what needs to change so I can take that next step and another? Figuring out how to get what I want in spite of all of this is a superpowered mindset shift. Another question that especially hits folks early in their career, especially folks who have a different background from a lot of people on their team, is one of belonging. Even very senior engineers can feel this, especially in new environments, like say at a massive conference far from home at altitude. Oh, why does it matter if we feel like we belong though, right? We're not in nursery school. I don't need to be liked to sling code. Maybe. Dr. Kat Hicks is a researcher whose writing on developer thriving is critical reading for developers. In one of her notes in an ongoing developer study, she mentions that if we don't think we're supported by our teams, if our teams don't let us make mistakes, if we don't feel like we belong as engineers, we tend to drop these behaviors, speaking up with a new solution, helping someone's mess, passing learnings along. These behaviors are existentially important for an organization. And I'm framing this in terms of being important to the product or the organization, because if we say, hey, this person feels like they don't belong and it is really bumming them out, a team's reaction might be like, I wish them the best, I do, but we don't have time to manage a grown-up professional's feelings. We are here to code. So for the code-focused technologists here, framing it as, hey, this sense of belonging has a concrete effect on our team's code's long-term health. This is more likely to get people's attention and get them to change their behavior. One very concrete thing that you can do here in this conference is Pac-Man circles. Now, what I mean by this is in your circular conversation configuration, you leave a gap. Let me show you. If you're standing with a couple people talking in this configuration and a new person wants to join, where do they stand? They have to come up in between two people and behind them, hoping that someone looks over their shoulder and sees them enough to shuffle around and move. So instead, leave a space. We are all about clear interfaces, right? So look at this. You walk up to this group, you know immediately where you fit in. And you all know what you do next. Take a little step to the side. This is something everyone can do. The person who joins your circle who may have been feeling a little shy themselves, they could be a new great contact. They might even be one of those community heroes that you look up to because wanting to belong is absolutely universal. So I have a question for you. Is unpalatable code a sign that you don't belong? Some of you are like, how is this even a question? If there exists a software team of people, I will belong on it. And others are like, tell me. So no, it doesn't mean that. But it turns out that if those of us who maybe already have implicit worries and questions about our belonging, we end up looking across a lot of data points to assuage or maybe reinforce our worst fears. And the people who research belonging say that the way we decide whether we belong or don't is not so much dependent on whether we have positive relationships with the people in the group, but rather we take the experiences that we have with the group and we make our own symbolic meanings from them. We wonder if some event means we don't belong. And our beliefs and our belonging impact our behavior in ways that impact our relationships, which does impact outcomes. This sense of belonging is critical to all kinds of success at work, which is why I'm taking time to address it explicitly, repeatedly, so you can hopefully settle this belonging piece and go back to being more kind of benignly annoyed by whatever overeager application of template metaprogramming. So these authors in the Handbook of Competence and Motivation Theory and Application found that understanding everyday adversities as normal challenges that can be overcome can help someone stay engaged in a way that lets them build relationships that contribute to their success. I was telling a non-programmer friend about how much I was struggling with this third-party library that some goon had decided to add to our code base. And yes, it was me, I was the goon who added it, but then some other people made it proliferate, and I didn't fully grok it enough to be genuinely productive in it. And my friend asked how much time my team was giving me during the workday to ramp up on the tool. But this wasn't a tool to me. This was a way of being. It was a paradigm shift based on identity, written and contributed to, by the way, by a couple devs who had at one point been personally unpleasant to me. I couldn't take a day or two off from regular coding tasks to kind of casually train myself up on a paradigm shift. I'd need 40 days in a desert. This was a sign. It was a sign that I was not one of them, that my brain did not automatically work that way. So why bother trying? People either understand and love this framework or they don't. And I knew that if I asked too many questions about it, my real questions, not like subtleties of the application, but like, no, really, how does this work and why? Why does it matter? This would further cement everyone's decision that I was not one of them. And so you can see how the cycle perpetuates. But if I'd had someone I was comfortable asking those really basic questions of, I know I could have worked through the challenges. I just didn't have anyone who could meet me where I was. So this is the advice that I give to interns, new college grads, anyone starting off something new. Find the person that you can ask your stupidest questions of and use that ramp to get up to the next level, and then leave the ladder there for the people who are coming after you. One of my mentors at work always manages to weave into conversations like, Laura, 10 years from now, when you're the one giving advice to noobs, or hey, that follow-up you did there, that is architect-level behavior. These are constant reminders that someone with institutional power thinks I belong. I hope you are so lucky that you have someone in your corner like this. Cultivate those relationships because they will keep you around through the times of real doubt. Another countermeasure to feeling like you don't belong, when first-gen college students are told, yes, you in particular are going to go through a tough adjustment period, that's part of it. They stick with it and through it more than those who didn't have that intervention. Now, some of you here are like, of course you suffer before you understand new things. That happens every day, every week, every year. But to those of us who still find many of the brains in this room intimidating, it helps to hear the process is largely the same for them too. They just employ a wide variety of behaviors that get them unstuck faster. Experts efficiently respond to errors. This is a bit I heard a decade ago. It still floors me when I remember it, that one major differentiator between an expert and a novice, or even intermediate level, is how effectively they respond to errors. They don't not encounter errors, right? They don't not find flaws in the system that can and do trip them up, but they respond effectively. They can try and discard 10 things that don't work in the time it takes a newer person to try and discard one. So you making mistakes, it does not mean you can't do this. And another way to really solidify for yourself that your struggles to track down this inscrutable bug are not unique and not intractable is to sit down with someone senior to you. Virtually is fine, it works, and look over their shoulder, watch them work. Nearly every time. They will use some tool you weren't familiar with. And they'll take an approach you hadn't thought of, by definition, right? Because if you had been familiar with the tool, if you had thought of the approach, you wouldn't have been so stuck. And let's say they actually do start by just retreading the same ground that you already went over. They check the same spots, they use the same tools. How validating is that as a beginner to see that an extremely senior person also starts by grepping for the error message and reading it twice? Looking over someone's shoulder only has positive outcomes. You will either develop new skills, get a boost of confidence that your existing skills are foundational for experts as well as beginners, or you'll find out that your problem is actually hard for everyone, and this senior person is also going to call in reinforcements. And you can watch who they call and how they phrase it, too. Now, mid-career is where most people spend most of their time, just statistically, right? So by now, you've developed these well-formed judgments and principled stances. You go to conferences, you learn about best practices. You go to conferences and you present best practices. And all along the way, you are still interacting with a bunch of code that is not yours and that is not at all up to your standards. So here's what gets thrown at me and ways that I cope. Frustration is a big one, right? You have the experience now of having made things better, and now you're working with lovely people who you really think should have known better, but they made choices that have some big downsides, and you are feeling stuck. Now, part of staying motivated in any situation is believing that you have some power to affect change. I worked in an engineering org once that had the ultra-empowering motto, anyone can fix anything. I asked for a splash screen design one time, and I got a PDF of the logo and a crash course in generating background color noise. And it's great to know that you can try to fix things, right? But the flip side of it is a little snide. I asked them about prioritizing making the website, whose target audience was high school students in the not too distant past, about making the desktop website responsive for mobile users. And I got, anyone can fix anything. It's not as actionable as it sounds, right? Not anyone can fix anything in anything approaching an appropriate amount of time or effort. I was an iOS developer whose web dev experience was 5 years out of date, which is an entire generation in web tech terms. Being explicitly offered that empowerment as a solution was actually more frustrating because now the website was still not responsive, but it was somehow also my fault. Instead, I highly recommend adopting some version of the Serenity Prayer. You've likely seen this before. Its origins are a little debated, but it's not even that old, only about 3 times as old as my code base. But people ask for serenity to accept what they can change, that they cannot, serenity to accept what they can't change, courage to accept what they can, wisdom to know the difference. In this world, though, we're dealing with software, right? One of my coworkers, I asked him if we'd be able to reconcile these 2 modes of profiling without duplicating work. And he says, of course, it's code. We can make it do whatever we want. So I would tweak this first line to accept the things that we decided not to change. And this helps me be okay with choosing an imperfect option. I left the bag to go in the road. I kept the baby. So if you're feeling frustratedly stuck, I keep seeing these patterns and they won't let me change them, try instead, I've chosen not to address them. So this is taking ownership of a bad choice, but it's also a little defeatist, maybe fatalistic. So let's keep going. Why aren't you addressing it? You're letting this problem lie, okay. What value of yours is that expressing? Maybe it really matters to a teammate. Maybe it's not worth the risk to QE right now. Maybe it's something as simple as I just don't want to get into it. Sure. If you get here, I'd urge you to keep going, to find some positive result, not just the lack of a bad one. I'm not going to get into it because I'm saving my energy for this other thing that really matters to me. When I remind myself that I've made an explicit priority decision to gain something, a whole weight falls off my shoulders. For a real-world, non-code example, we have downspouts for our gutters that end in clay pipes that go down through the ground and out to the sewer main. In a surprise to no one with ancient clay pipes, the intakes have kind of shifted over time and clogged. And so now when it rains, our front flower beds flood. So I put in a temporary fix. of these green perforated plastic extensions that kind of unroll and just direct the water away from the foundation. And then I got a quote for what it would cost to really fix it right. And now I've replaced the green, bright green, flimsy plastic redirectors with moderately tasteful brown, hard plastic redirectors. And every time I see them, I feel a stab of pride because they are saving me thousands of dollars. I found a cheap solution that was good enough, and it gives me inordinate joy. A little bit of triumph, even though it is technically the worst solution. Also, frustration, minor frustration, can signal a couple different things that are really good. Good for you, for your career, your team, even your code base. Now, one, it often crops up when things are not what you expected. And when things are often different from what you expected? When you're in a new situation, when you're learning. It's uncomfortable, but as long as the frustration stays small, it is not a crisis. The presence of minor frustration by itself, it is not a signal that anything about your context actually needs to change. Researching this tension, this discomfort versus growth, a point came up that resonated with and really surprised me. Life's challenges and resulting distress are not the primary obstacles to well-being. Instead, a focus on escaping these experiences prohibits values-based activity, which diminishes well-being over time. Now, I needed to sit with that for a minute, so I'm going to give you a breath too. Now, another framing of this idea from the same article, when it comes to well-being, reducing distress is only really worthwhile when it helps you pursue self-endorsed, meaningful, valued goals. Now notice, they're not saying here, it doesn't matter if you suffer, so power up, buttercup. No, they're saying notice the suffering and check in. Is it in service of something you value? Now this idea of psychological flexibility, it's been studied at length. And one technique that's popped up to train people up in it is called acceptance and commitment therapy, which basically emphasizes noticing distress, sure, and making decisions based on values, not upon the vagaries of internal events. I am in that photo, I don't like it. Maybe you value community or invention or safety, paying it forward, creative flexibility, the thing that drives you at your core and is different for everyone. You choose the uncomfortable, inconvenient thing in service of those values and of the goals that you've derived from them. Now, these people here researched psychological flexibility specifically in the context of work and found that people who are less avoidant of distress can better notice the degree to which they have control in a given situation. Because the more energy you spend hating the tech stack and the code around you, the less you'll be able to innovate your way out of it. Now remember how I sometimes decide to just accept that I am a very averagely intelligent bear and take all of that spare mental energy and use it deciding what to do next? I was very pleasantly surprised when I was putting this talk together to realize that this kind of oddball coping strategy of mine, it has some research backing. Another curveball for mid-career devs coming around again, it's belonging, the reprise. Sometimes you're trying to add or fix something in a code base that's so different from what you would have chosen. It kind of gently or not so gently pushes at you, right? If you assume that the differences come from a difference of values, this is one of those data points that can make you feel excluded from a team. These people don't care about the things I care about, and therefore I do not belong. You know what, though? You are augmenting the team with your values. The team needs you because they don't place the same emphasis on things that you do. Who would be a stickler for tests if it weren't for you? Who would be pedantic about move semantics? I'm usually the one on my team to say, hey, I know you're fulfilling the literal linter requirement of writing a comment above this API, but everyone reading the doc string is there because the function wasn't clear to them. Use different words. And now I like to think that when my teammates, both past and present, write API docs, they'll hear my voice in their head and they'll rephrase because I emphasized this different value. Now, if you keep asking people to do something and they keep ignoring you, that is not a healthy team dynamic, right? The way people respond to your difference matters, but the fact of the difference itself is not a sign that you shouldn't be there. And it may be why they hired you. A team made up of people exactly like me would not ship great software. Sometimes we butt heads respectfully, and that is a good thing. I highly value readable code, and I will talk your ear off about it if you let me. But we've got code in our code base that is, to me, completely inscrutable. And it's more important that, say, the brushing code is performant and well-tested than that it's easily changeable by newcomers. It is the right trade-off. One tricky ongoing tension is between the purist and the pragmatist. Let's get everything right versus let's ship it. And we all come down on different sides of this depending on the situation, right? And we are all only truly comfortable when everyone meets us exactly where we are, because anyone more lax than us is sloppy, and anyone more stringent than us is paranoid, right? And it's extra tricky because often the person who values getting things done will acknowledge the value in, okay, getting most of them right. But the person who insists on maximum correctness will rarely acknowledge the value in shipping earlier. They can be awfully, loudly judgy, like a real, what is so wrong with you as an engineer, as a person, that you are not morally offended by this software pattern? I know, not all purists, fine. Okay, but there is absolutely a time and a place for extreme robustness, though, right? Gosh. What I recommend for these situations where correctness really is critical is to keep the focus on the effects of code choices rather than the identity of the team. And that means saying things more like, if you do X, it could cause Y, so we're going to choose Z instead, rather than, how can you live like this? Keeping the focus on the code. You keep the focus on the code because acting like something is personally wrong with someone for not being so morally offended by a bit of code, that can make people doubt themselves all the way out of engineering. And that is not us, right? Because on a different project, someone's ability to live like this is what'll propel scientific research forward. It'll further prototyping. It'll prove that some complex interaction is possible and maybe just needs a little rehabilitation to be reusable. So I find myself much better able to handle other people's coding decisions when I start to deeply respect our different roles and appreciate the team is better for having us both. That's what makes the tension healthy. Now, this next section doesn't neatly fit into any kind of early, mid, late career category, so we're often an aside that unfortunately deeply cross-cuts our full professional lives. I'm talking about burnout, which is tough to talk about, right? Unlike most of the areas we touched on, this is not a day-to-day feeling. You can't go for a nice walk in the sunshine and recover from burnout. It can damage your life across multiple facets and take months or years to recover from. Luckily, there's researchers who focus their entire careers just on measuring burnout, and they've identified 3 classic axes that correlate highly with burnout. Now, one way I try to catch burnout in myself before it becomes too severe is partly to just know what these axes are so I can prioritize changing things if I'm getting too far away from health. Now, the first area is exhaustion. Exhaustion is statements like, I feel used up at the end of the workday. It's often having more demands than you can reasonably meet. People who score high on exhaustion surveys tend to start to become more cynical, too. Maybe some researchers say as a way to kind of disengage from these tasks that are draining them, like, this stuff doesn't matter anyway. Now, this is an area where I am personally extremely fortunate. I can leave for the evening, come back in the morning, and not have missed any critical decisions in Slack. Monday mornings don't have a slew of messages. It's honestly rare to have even one. The team is senior enough to know what needs urgency over a weekend and what doesn't. And I strongly believe that this is not just a kind culture that wants us to feel rested and happy, but a ruthlessly practical business decision. We cannot afford to have any of our team be so exhausted that they become cynical, that they lose interest in work. We can't afford to lose the folks who've been around for decades. We can't afford to lose the newer folks who will become the folks who've been around for decades. We have to continue to take care of the energy reserves so the company can continue to exist, much less thrive. I am so very grateful that by this point in my career, I've built up enough social capital that I'm comfortable pushing back about rest. Maybe someone new to the team sends a lot of after-hours weekend messages. It is a common work behavior, so it's easy for someone to just kind of unconsciously continue it, right? So I will step up to explicitly spell out this cultural norm for people. I'm actually more likely to do it when someone outranks me, because a high-ranking person's choices can change the whole team's norms, and this is not something that I'm willing to let just change incidentally. So a new manager, say, maybe feeling a great deal of responsibility for the team, wants to do a good job, might say, hey, I'm taking PTO next week, but don't worry, I'll be checking email and Slack. That's when I will kindly but firmly say, don't do that. And if you do, don't tell us, because the rest of the team is going to start thinking that they need to stay on top of work while they're off too. And the manager might say like, oh, I would never expect that of my team. I think they know that. And that's where I keep pushing back, because sometimes I get feisty and I kind of stir the pot, because that's not how the power dynamic works, right? When you're a manager, when you're a senior engineer, your behavior sets the standard for the team. Do as I say, not as I do, does not work. Sometimes I think of things in my off hours. Great, let's check out delayed send. But we can decide things so quickly when we're just DMing at 8 p.m. Like, okay, you're not wrong. But think about who you're excluding from decision-making when all of the real collaboration happens privately after hours. You're making an implicit power structure that other people on your team don't even know exists and can't access. And that's why people make meetings with agendas. It's not because they like to feel important because their calendars are full. No, it's because they don't want to say, you can participate in this discussion if and only if you happen to be online reading your messages at the right time. Now, I'm not saying don't go around and build consensus one by one, because that is how a lot gets done, but pay attention to how the timing of your questions affects who gets to be part of that consensus. Plus, C++ as a community, we skew towards senior engineers who are more often at an age that we are more likely to have kids. I meant to put this up here. If your team can say to a solid mid to late career dev that one of the perks of joining your team is that they will be able to put their kid to bed every night, that is hard to compete with on a recruiting front. Some of you might be staunch feminist allies, and I sincerely hope it's most of you, but many of you might not know how to show it in your professional contexts, because everyone you work with is also a man. Now, one very concrete thing that dads in particular can do for greater equality is normalize taking time off to be with your kids. I once saw a senior director, someone I'd never interacted with, he posted in a very wide Slack channel, hey everyone, I just want to call out how great it is that so-and-so came in on his paternity leave to see this project through to the end. And now I've had an interaction with that senior director. It was me up in his DMs saying, no, bad director. Like I said, I have a fix-it problem. But for real, new dads sometimes get told that there's nothing they can do to help with a newborn. This is real. And I'm sorry, have you met a baby? When I was pregnant for my second kid, we got a Big Brother book for our older kid to kind of help him get emotionally ready. It turns out I needed it because the book said things like babies need help to eat, they need help to sleep, they need help to move, to get dressed, to take baths. And me, as a second-time parent, reading to a reasonably independent 4-year-old was like, that is a lot. Babies need all that for real? I don't know how many of you have even noticed that I left out diapers. Anyway, there's plenty of work to go around. And the more fathers, parents of all genders, but specifically fathers here, can really tip the scales, the more you take your full parental leave. and are truly offline, the more hiring managers are going to have to assume that anybody, whether their body is set up to bear children or not, might take several well-earned months away from work to bond with a brand new kid. But your rest doesn't just have to be about like fighting nonsense gender roles, right? I once worked on a distributed team that was, whatever reason, we were in the habit of always explaining why we were signing off at the end of the day. Like, oh, I have a dinner in the city, gotta take the dog for a walk, a cappella group practice, like what have you. But one coworker, we were mostly on the West Coast and he was on the East, and he would turn down a calendar invite with, oh, I can't make that, it's after 5 o'clock. I'm like, you can do that? So now I've tucked this away, that let's pick this up first thing tomorrow is actually a complete thought. And I try to normalize that wherever I go. You don't have to have unbreakable plans to stop work for the day. So that's exhaustion. Another main axis of burnout is cynicism. Cynicism doesn't have to be outright negativity towards your work. It includes indifference. Cynicism can be a side effect of exhaustion and powerlessness. You have too much to do given your resources, and sometimes you can't change the things you want to for reasons. And as a kind of defense mechanism, you stop caring. Like, nothing I do matters anyway, so it's okay, I can let it slide. For me, when I feel this utter powerlessness, the only thing that helps is raw data to the contrary. There's a couple ways to achieve that. Take a hack week. Maybe you notice this one pattern that's proliferated throughout your code base. To feel good about your own agency, you're gonna actually take the time and refactor it. Maybe it's even line level stuff. You're adding smart pointers in a lot of places that they would have been used had the option existed when this code was written. Demonstrating that you do have power and autonomy can help keep this intense cynicism at bay. But you have to be careful with this solution. I don't know if you've ever looked into the eyes of a quality engineer when you've said like, hey, by the way, we refactored something that is narrowly focused but broadly scoped. We're like, say, using iterators instead of for loops just everywhere. It didn't make sense to feature flag it, and it's not really constrained to one area of the code base. It's kind of a very small part of every component in the app, but don't worry, they're all better now. And your hardworking, also autonomy-preferring quality engineers now have to decide how to prioritize this far-reaching change that you have just dropped in their lap. You're adding to their exhaustion, to their powerlessness. So let's not quite do that. Instead, this is where your cross-functional relationship building skills will really come in key. And I'm so sorry, because this is the opposite of hiding in a cave of coding and coming out with library upgrades engraved on a tablet. If you're going to pull something like this off, you need a co-conspirator on the testing side who believes you when you say that this change will prevent bugs in the future and trusts that you will not irrevocably introduce this change right before a major release. They will help socialize your change through without destabilizing and demoralizing your utterly irreplaceable team, because they also have to cope with the effects of your autonomy-seizing code changes. Now, so I do have a coworker whose response to code that is kind of long in the tooth and clearly technically suboptimal actually is to rewrite it until it's not painful anymore. He is the kindest, most precise chainsaw wielder that I have ever met. Plus, his entire face just lights up when he has a chance to remove a dependency or prune dead code or streamline ownership. Reducing header file scope, I've never seen him actually be given a puppy on his birthday, but I feel like his reaction is the same, just unadulterated joy. And I've noticed several behaviors of his that means that he gets away with this. He gets to spend his days ripping things apart and putting them back together. Better, I promise. The first thing he does is own the fallout. When you've changed a lot of things in a complex system, something is going to break in a way that you didn't anticipate. Like, this code base maybe gets packaged across a variety of contexts because C++ is so cross-platform. Your changes can mess up on a system that you don't even have access to. Your team needs to build in time for you to own finding and fixing these failures. In our case, we have a lot of automated tests in a variety of systems, so this will get caught in CI before it actually affects any dev machines. Another thing he does, he will submit a PR with 150 changed files. But the exact same pattern is changed in each of them. There's not a lot of like, oh, while I was there, I updated these subtle things instead. He makes a single kind of change. So even though the code reviews are long, they are gloriously simple, usually. He protects his coworkers' mental reserves by making his PRs as simple as he can. He also makes the case strongly to senior leadership. For better or worse, in a large legacy code base, you're going to have a variety of issues to pick from, right? If you want to modernize, streamline, whatever. If you can pick one that you can show is contributing to slow compile times or introduces ODR violations or restricts some performance critical operation to the main thread, you're more likely to get buy-in from both the prioritizers and your teammates. Also, I mentioned he is kind. I've only ever worked at one large C++ organization, so I'm just speaking from this perspective, but the people on my team have been around a long time. I am coming up on 5 years. I am still a rookie. It's not false humility. There's dozens of people with a decade plus. There's another dozen or two with 2 decades or more. If you are cruel or rude about old code you find, it is awfully likely that the person who wrote it is still there. They know the edge cases that they worked around, and they probably have more social and organizational power than you do. So keep it professionally kind. All right, so these behaviors can help you get the political, technical, kind of social capital that you need to actually wield the chainsaw. Taking some positive actions in support of your values, that can help alleviate cynicism and make the code better, right? That's technically why we're here. So that was cynicism. I want to look at the last axis of burnout. In professional efficacy. And this is statements like, at my work, I am confident that I am effective at getting things done. And I am not sure if I want to ask folks to raise their hand if they agree with this, because maybe I'll feel alone in my however often ineffectiveness. Or it'll only be a few of you who agree, and then I'm going to be really sad about the whole state of our industry. But my personal hypothesis is that many, many of us feel ineffective because of the morass of other people's code that we have to deal with. And this is the area where I also have a lot of strategies to offer, because somehow, for the past nearly 5 years on Photoshop, I've moved around from one section of the code base to another, and I keep having to learn large new sections. So let's talk about some ways that you can respond effectively to the structured cacophony that is your code base. You might say, I can't be effective in this code base. I don't know where anything is. Navigating other people's code is genuinely tricky and can easily make you feel less effective, pushing you along that axis of burnout. A more expert behavior is going to get really, really good at navigating. I'm going to show you a quick example of how I use search in my usual IDE, Apple's Xcode. I use it more effectively than 90% of the people I know in Xcode. You might have terms in your code base that you grep for and get over 100,000 results, like layer in Photoshop. You can narrow this in a couple ways. The word layer might also hit words like player. If I just want that single word, I'll use a matching word. And that'll cut it down to a mere 20,000 results. But maybe you're looking for assignments. In Xcode search window, all the way down at the bottom, there's a little filter box that no one knows is there. You can filter your existing results on, say, the equals sign. Finally, and this is a pain to set up, so most people don't do it right away until they see someone else do it, realize how much effort it could save them. You set up advanced search scopes. You can match to directories. You can exclude things like JavaScript or generated files, what have you. And then you name your scopes. So when you're searching for how to do something in your tests, you can quickly narrow it there. Or you're looking in one particular platform, you can narrow there. Now, many of you do not use Xcode at all, much less capitalize it properly. But these are not exactly cutting-edge search features, right? Your environment is gonna allow super customized searching too. Learn what all the arguments to ripgrep do. Take this as extra motivation to really invest the time to become an expert enough searcher that when people see you look things up, they'll say, "Wow, how did you get there so fast?" Another thing that might make you feel less effective, recompiling. It takes forever. It gets me out of the zone. Yep. That is true. It's going to continue to be true. So get good at not recompiling as good as you can. A lot of it is out of our control, right? Your company's virus scanner touched something and now Xcode is like, wait, hold on, I gotta make sure these symbols are still where I left them. Or you accidentally edited something in one of those header files and now it's time for a nice coffee break. And by the way, just don't have those header files is not actionable advice for most of us. But you don't have to recompile usually if you don't change code. So get really good with breakpoints. You won't have to fight your way back into the zone quite so much. You can add logging from a breakpoint in Xcode or Visual Studio's UI, in GDB with dynamic logging. I've run LLDB expressions from a breakpoint and changed values in my code at runtime. Like, oh, I meant to set this up so the value was false. Now it is. Maybe you've got some lines that you meant to comment out and you forgot, hit a breakpoint before them, you move the instruction pointer past them. In Xcode and Visual Studio, it's literally click and drag. This is not always going to do what you want, right? Because optimizations make everything go haywire. But when rebuilding takes on the order of dozens of minutes, it is an excellent idea to at least try. And there's probably a fifth of you, maybe, that I can hear thinking, well, if you were using this other language, compile times wouldn't be a problem. And yes, you're right. But the code bases I'm talking about here, the ones that we're working in every day, they're not going to get rewritten in Lua in any way that's meaningful to us in the foreseeable future. We're going to be watching those little floating squares nestling into their Visual Studio box for a while, and we need to be effective while we do. Now, this next coping technique I developed while I was parenting babies who were waking up at all hours of the night, and my short-term memory was absolutely Swiss cheese, but I've stuck by it while exploring complex areas of the code base. I write down all of my hypotheses. Because every so often you'll think, hey, I bet it's this dinglehopper that's jamming things up. But in order to test that, you need to trace through 6 other steps. And oh, right, now recompile and build and run. By the time you get it back in the right state, you genuinely forget what it was you were curious about in the first place. And then it's, well, was I expecting this to be the same or different if my hypothesis was true? Was it the same? I don't know. Your hand-built personal guidebook of hypotheses will steer you true. It also guards better against interruptions. It's like turning your whole process into one that's tail recursive. Your one stack, your recent hypothesis note has everything you need to get going again. Now, you can do this for planned breaks, like your nights, your weekends, which you take off, right? I call this parking on a downhill slope. Anything that makes it easier to get started next time. So when you think, I know just what to do next at 4:30 p.m., great, write it down and stop. Because it always takes a bit to get back in the groove of coding, right? For simple or hard projects. When you're working in a large, maybe unintuitive code base, it can take so much time to page all of that context back into memory. So before I leave for a weekend, or honestly, sometimes for lunch, I leave myself a keyword and a checklist in the middle of my CPP file, because I'm not fool enough to type in headers I don't need to. But you get back to work after a long weekend or a holiday, you'll be so grateful to your old self for a list like this, because you last week knew exactly what to try next and what state your branch was in. Starting your week or your day with a nice little checklist with specific guideposts, that gets you moving again. When you write them, you're going to think you're leaving too much detail, but coming back to your work and knowing exactly which function you were suspicious of and why is gold. Oh, one of my favorite questions came from my coworker, Ronnie, who's a brilliant principal engineer in a vastly different time zone, who we brought in to assist on a new simple feature extension that, of course, turned out to be full of complicated edges. And she said, OK, start by telling me what file and class we're working in. I'll familiarize myself with it during my day tomorrow. We can talk about strategies. Now, she is extremely senior. And one of the ways she showed that was by short-circuiting the process of getting oriented to a new problem, and then explicitly allowing enough time to learn before coming back together to talk solutions. It's like when I walk into my local hardware store, like think more Ace than Home Depot, I notice that the person at the front will always say like, oh, can I help you find anything? And I used to assume that this question was kind of talking down to me, that they doubted I knew what I was doing. So I would say, nope, I got it. I'd wander the whole store kind of as purposefully as I could. But then I went a couple times with my dad, who's a super handy person, like leads Habitat for Humanity teams. He's always looking for his next construction project. He loves visiting my house. And when he walks into this place, he greets the staff and says, oh, we're looking for shims. And the person says, aisle 14, left side. And we don't even break stride. This orienting discussion is an essential part of how experts save their time and energy for tackling root problems. They're more effective. They may be less exhausted. All these systems that contribute to burnout are so interconnected. So all this is to say, paying attention to burnout is so important for your long-term career health. It's not always in your control, right? That's often a large part of the problem. But it is an unfortunately common experience. And once it gets severe, you need radical change and a lot of time to recover. Just like you don't ignore carpal tunnel syndrome, like those twinges in your wrists, right? Like you will take quick action when something is threatening your ability to physically type. Take that quick action against burnout too. It is significantly easier to recover earlier than later. All right, I can't speak to truly late career. I'm not there yet. When I'm in my 70s, I can drop wisdom on you then, but for now it's just late-er. Feeling that cropped up that surprised me was wistfulness. See, I'd imagined that coding at a more senior level was like being a landscape architect at a well-established estate. And that even if maybe a lot of the grounds had gotten overgrown, I could create for myself a well-tended walled garden with a couple well-defined entry and exit points, an interior with reasonable scopes, non-mutating functions, all the rest that makes code feel comfortable to me. And in this garden, maybe me and the other landscape architects, we look out proudly at what we've built. Maybe we tweak a soaker hose here and there. And we mostly just cheers with our sweet iced tea as we continue to make a well-functioning system function even better. I don't know how many of you also thought that that's what being a senior engineer would be like. But most of us are in a different reality. Here's what Sarah May, another brilliant engineer, said about this. 2 kinds of companies. Some with consistent architectures, some still in business. We writers of C++ are constantly kind of bridging and tunneling and leaping across awkward architecture gaps. I personally am almost never working in a perfectly walled garden. I have to go through 17 steps in unrelated systems to get to a root cause. In the garden metaphor, it's like I need to investigate why the grafted branches we're adding on this one particular apple tree keep failing. And I realize, oh, there's this one local microclimate that's too soggy. I can fix that. I just need to patch the irrigation system. Oh, the parts are in this utility shed. Wow, they're buried in, people put a lot of unrelated things in there with the other utilities. I don't know if that's what coding feels like to you sometimes. Also, when the apple tree is responsible for millions of dollars of annual revenue. But we don't see the parts that are working well. Like, I don't often stop to appreciate that our house no longer has this fire-prone knob and tube electricity. I do notice the gently sloping floor. So what I'd advise here is taking a minute to appreciate what works. Maybe this means watching someone external to your company, making a video tutorial and using your product. Maybe it's looking at past release notes. The marketing team probably added a bunch of bullet points, unless maybe you're an iOS app and then you get bug fixes and performance improvements. But there is a lot of stuff that is genuinely good about your app. And you know that the angriest users are the ones who get the most value from your software, right? They have the most to lose when a bug gets in the way because so much of the software works so well, nearly all the time. And I know it doesn't help in the moment when you're like digging through that utility shed, but taking that minute to realize, hey, the reason that we can't regrade this whole lot is because there's a dozen mature trees in there. It helps to remember that we're working around these things because they are useful and valuable. And another thing that can happen to folks later in their careers is a really intense desire and ability to control other people's code. I wanted to call this section domineering, but then I realized that that was too aggressive. But influence allows a full kind of range. But you're now at a level where there's code that you wrote a decade or two ago, and some upstart has come in and wants to change it. You know that it needs to change, but then it will no longer be your code. It will become other people's code. And as someone who's been on the team long enough to have written the legacy code, you have the professional power to stop them. Do you take it? How much do you stop what you're doing with your current feature to try to influence their direction? Now, I worked at a medium-small startup one time where a series of cascading failures ended up deleting the production database. And the customer service director, who oversaw the response while the backend folks scrambled to respond, said to us after it was all over, "Don't ever do that again." But I'm glad that this happened when it was at the size that we were, because this was a valuable stress test of our client support system. So maybe some upstarts doing it wrong isn't actually the worst outcome for your product. Like, think of the skills that you learned, the behaviors that you adopted when you took on something that was a stretch for you and that you made mistakes on. You developed maybe a new insistence on robust tests. You now have a visceral learning that some code is very complicated for reasons. You probably got pretty good at justifying decisions to senior leadership. You desperately want your teammates to get very, very good at these things. That is a lot of what is standing in the way between you and your iced tea. Now, this is also where a strong triage skill will serve you well. How mission critical is the component that they're replacing? How much involvement is reasonable for you so you can mitigate the most catastrophic effects while making sure that your teammates develop these battle-tested skills? You don't have to make it all or nothing. Let the team grow. All right, last later career bugbear, and then we'll wrap up. You get to a point where you learn a new tool or create a cool little working demo, and people are like, "You should present that." And you, maybe, many of you, super don't want to. And if that's you, I'm sure you have excellent reasons, but I want to nudge you a little bit, so hear me out, because I want to see people more like me giving talks, more women. Please, I can count on one hand the number of conference talks that I've been to that have passed my version of the conference Bechdel test, which is where a female attendee asks a question of a female speaker, and neither is me. CppCon actually augmented this number by one, still fits on one hand. I want to see more people not like me giving talks. I want to see more people of color. I want to see more trans people up here. So I'm an experienced speaker, more than many programmers. Like, also, I got invited on this stage, which is an enormous honor. So I'm going to be the expert whose shoulder you look over here. And I'm going to tell you my behaviors and mindsets that make any of this work. So, hand to God, the reason I decided that I could give my first public talk was that I saw another woman stand up and give a talk that was absolutely average. And I thought, oh, I could do that. So now, one of the ways that I cope with pre-presentation jitters is reminding myself, you know what, if I bomb out there, I'm going to inspire someone else to get up and submit and absolutely kill it. And another maybe surprising perspective, conferences take a lot of social energy, right? And you might think, I'm an introvert. I can't get up in front of a bunch of people. But guess what? The energy is different from stage. Because I'm alone up here. I have near full control over my environment. If someone pipes up and says something unexpected or rude, someone else is going to jump in and handle that for me. This is not CPP now. I'm noticing for you all, like I'm noticing you as I talk to you, right? But this is not real interactive energy. Like, it's not low energy, right? But if back and forth conversations make you nervous, this is a great place to be. Plus, if you kind of like talking to people, but you're not always sure how to really approach them and start a conversation, after you've given a conference talk, other people start coming up to you. They pick up so much of that social slack. They self-select to talk to you based on something you have in common that they've already figured out. A lot of times, they'll even have a conversation topic ready to go. It takes so much of that initial social pressure off after you've given a talk. If you like being able to kind of anonymously hide at a conference, this is not a good choice. I will give you that. But conversation starting is so much easier after you've given your talk than before. It is a real conference social cheat code. Also, we're back, it turns out. Not belonging again. Another benefit of being on stage, in person especially, you get a lot of concrete signals that you belong. Event organizers remind you to make travel arrangements. In the CppCon Discord, my username gets a custom speaker role. Maybe just before you start, you might think, have they made a terrible mistake? Are they, am I in the wrong room? Are they gonna send me away? But actually, a team of people arranges an entire room of furniture to make it abundantly clear that there's time and space for you. When I am here, it is more clear than anywhere else that it is my turn to talk and that I do belong. All right, so I'm gonna highlight some of the behaviors that I think will help your reentry post-conference in a few days. Look over a shoulder. Learn those behaviors that make experts efficient. Get good at orientation and navigation. Honing those skills is going to serve you in every code base you visit. You will feel more effective because you will be more effective. When you break out the chainsaw and large-scale refactors, if you're considerate enough, your team might actually start asking you to do it more. Please, please protect your time to rest and reset. If you've got any influence, use it to protect your teammates' downtime too. Spend time with your kids in a way that takes you away from work. Okay, that is not restful, sure, but make it clear that this is the normal thing that very senior men in the workplace do too. Make it not a big deal. And scrape what you can and paint over the rest, because you have finite resources. And I know you want to chase down every last detail because you take pride in doing good work, but you must not drop the baby. Now, when you've gotten up somewhere, leave the ladder behind you, and leave a space for that new person before they walk up to your circle. We've got to make a lot more room for a lot more people, not just in our conversations, but in the foundations of architecture and on stages around the world. So let's bring it home. You may have heard of Chesterton's fence, the idea that if you see a fence and you don't know why it's there, do not remove it. This is a humble and curious way to approach unknowns. And that humble curiosity has its place. Many senior C++ devs, though, we do have enough context to accurately judge that this fence is in the wrong spot. Or maybe if it is in the right spot, it was made of the wrong materials. The lumber was not rated for ground contact because it's amateur hour over here. It's not hubris. You are actually right. And you're still going to choose to leave it be. You might even work this janky fence into your new plans because looking at the whole, evaluating this component in terms of its role in your big picture goals at the product level, company level, and at the personal level, that's going to mean letting some things go unfixed. So hold on to that thought, that this is all in service of your much larger goals. And as you go, I hope this talk has given you enough tools to stay in the game, to keep building on top of, around, beyond other people's code. Thank you.